On Sunday, June 22nd, in the early hours of the morning before dawn in Iran, the United States bombed three important strategic nuclear sites in Iran: Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The topic of this video is going to be, how is Iran going to respond? Iran has several options at its disposal. In my last video, I showed that Iran definitely has the capability of shutting the Straits of Hormuz to commercial traffic. This would inflict great harm on the global economy and on the United States. However, according to long-established and well-developed doctrine in Iran, I think it's fairly unlikely that the Iranians are actually going to be taking this step of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz at this moment. I think that this is a definite possibility later down the line, but not immediately, and I'm going to tell you why. According to Iran's security doctrine, there's really two conditions under which Iran would take the extreme measure of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. The first condition would be if Iran is prevented from exporting its oil into the global markets. For example, if Iran's oil producing facility or if its ports were militarily attacked and it was disabled from being able to export to the rest of the world. Under those conditions, everyone from the Ayatollah to Iran's presidents to various of its leaders have said that if Iran is not able to export to the rest of the world, then nobody else in the region will be allowed to either. The second condition, which might trigger Iran to shut down traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, is if they feel that the Islamic regime that leads the Islamic Republic of Iran were actually endangered. In other words, if the Islamic regime feels that it might be overthrown, either externally or internally, or by means of some combination of both, they would resort to this contingency. Now, the important thing to see here is that neither of these conditions has been met. Therefore, I do not think that Iran's next move will be to block traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, blocking traffic through the Strait of Hormuz could actually create a situation where it would make it more likely that the regime in Iran could be overthrown, and obviously they're going to want to avoid that. Therefore, I'm going to share with you what I think is a much more likely sequence of events. The first thing that I think is going to happen is that there's going to be a fairly limited strike against U.S. military facilities in the Middle East that are going to strike the facilities, but which will probably lead to a minimal or no loss of U.S. life. Iran wants to do this because they do not want to draw the United States into this war, because if they draw the United States into this war, the probability of the regime in Iran surviving becomes a lot lower. And remember, the number one objective of this regime at this point is self-preservation. Now, the second thing that I think will happen after the Iranians have shown some sort of a response that allows them to save face while at the same time keeping the United States out of the conflict, what's going to happen is that the war with Israel will continue. The Israelis have not achieved their strategic objectives yet, and they're going to continue to bomb Iran. They're going to continue to attack the Iranians, and this back and forth war of blows between the two are going to continue probably for several weeks. In fact, until Israel is able to achieve its strategic objectives, I believe that they're not going to stop. Therefore, in this exchange of blows, both sides are likely to grow increasingly desperate over time, as both sides are going to be feeling some sort of great urgency to bring an end to the conflict. So this means that both sides are likely to escalate. Every day that this war drags on makes it more likely that there's going to be an escalation. Now, this type of escalation could take several forms. From the Israeli side, it can mean that they could decide to attack some of Iran's oil export facilities. Another way that this could escalate is simply that if the Iranian government is actually feeling that it could potentially lose control of its own population over the course of several weeks or months unless it brings an end to the war, they might actually resort to blocking the Strait of Hormuz as a means to bring international pressure against Israel to stop its attacks. Because as we've discussed in prior videos, if Iran blocks the Strait of Hormuz, it would cause oil prices to shoot up over $100, $200, maybe even up to $300, which would cause the global economy and global markets to crash. in those circumstances, the entire world would want to bring an end to the conflict and therefore put pressure on Israel to cease its attacks on Iran. So let's review what I think is going to happen in the next few weeks. First of all, there's going to be a limited strike by Iran on U.S. military interests that is going to lead to either no loss of life or very limited U.S. casualties. Under these conditions, the United States is probably not going to strike back and will try to leave it at that. Second, the war is going to drag on. And third, as the war drags on, the probabilities of escalation increase. And that's where I really think that the danger arises, which is that Iran, out of desperation, may actually shut down the Strait of Hormuz, either to preserve itself or as a direct response to the fact that their oil export infrastructure has been harmed. And as I've said, the Iranians have been very clear that if their ability to export oil is harmed, then there will be no oil coming out of that region to the rest of the world. So this brings up a very important question for investors. What do you do in this situation where there is so much uncertainty? Now, despite the fact that I do believe that there's going to be this escalation, I also, for reasons that I've explained in other videos, don't think that markets are going to sell off very hard or that oil prices are going to shoot up too high unless there's actually tangible evidence that oil flows out of the Middle East have been affected. Due to a principle that I've discussed in other videos called the paradox of overvaluation, the price of any asset tends to reflect the opinions of an extreme optimistic fringe of market participants that participate in that particular market. Therefore, the price of oil, for example, is going to reflect the opinions of those most optimistic about the outcome of this particular conflict. Those people that are most optimistic, they are not going to change their minds regarding their belief that this is going to blow over until, in fact, there is actually an event such as an attack on oil installations in Iran or attack by Iran on oil installations in the Middle East, such as in Iraq or in Saudi Arabia. Until something like that happens, those that are most optimistic are going to hold on to that optimism. And since they're the ones that actually control the pricing, because again, in an auction, the asset that is sold is always sold to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder is always part of an optimistic fringe. So we're in a binary situation here that until we actually have the event and that it's happened, and in fact, there's even going to be a delayed reaction after it happens, but until some sort of key event like that happens, markets are probably not going to crash and the oil price is probably not going to spike too high. Therefore, as an investor, this gives you an opportunity to position your portfolio strategically depending on how you see this situation unfolding. But regardless of how you think this is ultimately going to unfold, I would definitely encourage investors to really look at their exposures and adjust the risk in their portfolios in accordance with the risk that they see that this is going to actually develop into a major situation where we could have a major oil price shock that causes the US and the global economy to go into a recession, which would in turn cause a crash in global financial assets such as stocks. Now, I have two different services myself where I manage two separate portfolios where I manage these risks and I manage these opportunities in very different ways. I have one conservative portfolio that I manage in my service on the Seeking Alpha marketplace called Successful Portfolio Strategy. And there we try to capitalize on this situation, but we do so in a relatively conservative fashion. I have another service where we're much more aggressive and where we use options. This particular service, you can find it on InvestorAcumen.com, and it's called the Crisis Opportunity Portfolio. In this portfolio, we try to achieve gains of well over 100%. Now, whatever you decide to do, please make sure to subscribe to this channel, because in my next video, I'm going to discuss why it is that this war is far from over and why it's going to last a lot longer than people think. And what this means, as I hinted earlier in the video, is that this is going to increase the probability that we really are going to get escalation and we're going to get a really big market moving event. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.